When my dad visited his relatives and they told him that he should feel at home, he used to say, "No, I don't want to feel at home. I want to be treated as a guest." I could understand why he joked like that, because being a guest means that you are served by the host and that you don't have any other obligations than to behave yourself more or less normally. To not make any scandals, to not break anything, or to not burn the house down. Being a guest for a while is pleasant, especially if your host makes you feel welcome and comfortable. But how is it to be a guest in a foreign country? Not as a tourist, but as an immigrant. And when do you stop being a guest? What does it take to make you feel at home one day, with all the rights and obligations that entails? When I was a kid, I saw refugees from Africa on TV, how they received food from the Red Cross. I felt pity for them, and I felt fortunate to not be in their situation. But suddenly, my life changed. I myself became a refugee in Norway. I was 18 years old, and I remember how I was standing in a line to get food from the Red Cross, together with refugees from Africa and other conflict areas of the world. How did this happen? Well, I grew up in Kosovo, in the former Yugoslavia, a country torn apart by wars in 1990s, a war that made me a refugee. Standing in a line in Norway to get food and staring at the iconic flag of the Red Cross made me feel small and miserable. I left the queue and found myself a hiding place where I could cry. But I decided to accept my fate and made the best of it. It can feel humiliating to get food from humanitarian organizations, but in the same time, you must be grateful for all the help you get. All of us can come into situations where we need help from others. I also comforted myself that this situation was temporary, that I was a guest in Norway who was to return home again as soon as the war was over. But I ended up living permanently in Norway. And I do not feel as a guest anymore. Norway is my home now. In all cultures and religions, there are traditions of hospitality. In India and Nepal, it is said that the guest is God. They have stories about how God transformed himself into a guest and then rewarded his host for the hospitality. So, the guest is a test from God. In the culture I come from, a guest is holy. Ethnic Albanians have something they call besa, which is a kind of loyalty guarantee and which means that you have to protect your guests. Strangers who are in danger and knock on your door are to be welcomed in and taken care of. This tradition was used when the Jews sought refuge at Muslim and Christian families during the World War II. Despite cultural differences, I think we can distinguish between two types of guests. Guests you appreciate and guests you tolerate. Imagine having a party at home. Some guests you would very much like to have there. Others you invite just because you have to. And some may even show up without being invited. It is similar with immigration policies around the world. In most countries, there is a system of distinction between desirable and less desirable forms of immigrations. Governments actively facilitate the arrival of skilled migrant workers and experts that they need. They can feel welcome from day one. Asylum immigrants, on the other hand, may not feel welcome in the same way. How was it for me? Actually, I felt quite welcome in Norway because most people had sympathy with war refugees from the Balkans. But for a very long time, I felt as a guest and a stranger in my new country. And there are three main reasons for that. Firstly, I had a temporary stay in mind, as guests usually have. Secondly, I felt I had to be grateful and polite and not behave as if I were at home. In Kosovo, I would complain about something without blinking, but here I thought, what will Norwegians say? Maybe they will say, oh, here comes a foreigner who complains and tells us how to do things in our own country instead of being thankful that we let him be here. Thirdly, I was constantly reminded of my role as a guest by both those who welcomed me, showed curiosity by asking me where do I come from, how it is in my home country, and how I like Norway, and those who told me to go back home. When you think you have forgotten this guest host thing, such remarks pulls you back and makes you really feel alienated again. Shifting from being a guest to feeling at home is a journey in itself. Had I only focused on negative comments I have received, it would be very hard for me to feel at home. But in this journey, in feeling more and more at home, two factors have been crucial. One is my social mobility, other is positive signals I have received from my fellow Norwegians. I felt more accepted as I took higher education and became part of the middle class. This kind of class journey makes you safer not only financially, but also socially and identity-wise. You simply feel more confident in yourself. Go-home comments makes less of an impression when you have a secure job and a position in society with Norwegian friends and a network around you. But how is it for those who are socially marginalized? They can feel more alienated in the terms of identity. There are even people who are born here of immigrant parents and still don't feel at home in Norway. Passport and the citizenship is not enough to give you a sense of belonging. We are talking about feelings here. It is in the host's best interest to make new members of the society feel welcome. For me, a welcoming society is not a society that opens borders for unlimited immigration, but a society that is good on including the migrants they have accepted. As a guest or as an immigrant, you will get mixed signals from the host society. Globalists have a more flexible approach to the term home and are thus, in principle, more hospitable. The idea here is that people should be able to move freely in search for a better life. This is what we humans always have done throughout our history. We have moved from one place to another and thus changed the world and ourselves. For the nationalists, on the other hand, the nation state is the home. The idea here is that everyone should be the master in their own house and treat other nations with respect. Without nation states, no freedom or security or any welfare state. That's why borders and control are necessary. For nationalists, the global village is a kind of utopia. Both positions have good points. But the problem with nationalism is when you consider the nation state to belong only to people who share same culture and ethnic background. When you consider minorities or immigrant groups as uninvited guests, or even worse, as intruders, as a threat. So the question is, how do you come to terms with all this? How welcoming the society is when you arrive is beyond your control. But you should not base your perception of the host population solely on what extremists say about immigrants. If you do so, it will be harder for you to feel at home. I'm not saying that you should ignore racism and discrimination, but just remember, especially when times get rough, that most people are kind. The transition from being a guest to feeling at home is not something that happens overnight. It is a natural adaptation process. So my advice to migrants who have settled in the new country is try to feel at home and try to take responsibility for yourself and for your new community. In our time, identity issues get greater attention than social inequality. But neither of them are static. I started in Norway as a poor refugee who received food from the Red Cross, but now I belong to the middle class. I started as a guest and a stranger, but now Norway is my home. I wish my father was still around so he could see how I made my journey and how much value it is on becoming a new member of the household. We who live together in a nation state have different backgrounds. We cannot and should not just delete them. We do not necessarily have same past, but we have a common future, a common destiny. That's what defines a society. We are in the same boat, or rather, we live in the same house.